So in today's lesson, we're going to continue our discussion of the body systems by looking at the respiratory system. So most people, when they think about the respiratory system, they think about breathing. So breathing in, taking in oxygen as a part of our air, and then exhaling and breathing out some carbon dioxide. And that is indeed what is happening. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at this process in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to do before we go too much further is we're going to talk about the link between the digestive system and the respiratory system, because I've included here in my definition that the respiratory system is responsible for providing oxygen needed by the body and removing carbon dioxide produced when food is broken down. And of course we know that the digestive system is what allows food to be taken into our body and then broken down so that we can use the components of our food for energy. So this brings us to our next topic, which is cellular respiration. And so cellular respiration is not quite the same thing as just inhaling and exhaling. It's what happens at the cellular level in terms of the oxygen being utilized in conjunction from glucose, which comes from our food, in order to produce energy in our cells. So I'm actually going to add that into this equation, energy, because that's kind of the important part. That's why we need to take in food, and it's why we need to take in oxygen. So let's add this into the second molecular equation, equation written in formulas. So glucose is a type of sugar, and it comes from our food. It's a component of the food that we eat. It's what is metabolized first to produce energy. But in order for glucose to be broken down to produce this energy that we want, we need oxygen. And so digestive system produces our glucose, provides the glucose source. Respiratory system allows for oxygen to be taken into our body so that our cells can use it. And the two of those together will produce some products aside from energy, products that are waste products that our body needs to get rid of. And so one of those is carbon dioxide and the other one is water. So most of us think about carbon dioxide being exhaled when we take a deep breath out, but few of us think about water. So I'm going to remind you of what happens on a cold winter day when you're out in the morning, maybe waiting for your bus, and all of a sudden you exhale. You'll see sort of like what appears like smoke, and really what that is just the water vaporizing, the water vapor coming out of your mouth, and that cold air causes it to be a little bit more visible. So the chemical formula for all of these are written below. This is the chemical equation written in formula form for cellular respiration, and you need to know this. So glucose is C6H12O6. Oxygen, of course, is O2, as you know, because it's diatomic. CO2, carbon dioxide, and H2O. Now, if I wanted to balance this, I could add in some values here, and you can double check that for yourself to see that I'm correct. But make sure that you're understanding the process of cellular respiration, and if you need to know more about this or you have some questions, please feel free to ask me in class. So we've talked about how the digestive system and the respiratory system are connected. I want to take a minute to talk briefly about how the circulatory system and the digestive system are connected. So we haven't talked about the circulatory system next, but I think you're aware just through your everyday life that we have veins and we have arteries in our body. We have blood vessels that allow our blood to travel around in our body. And so but we talked about, oxygen coming into our lungs and then carbon dioxide moving out of our body when we exhale. But how does the waste CO2 get to the lungs from our body cells, and how does the oxygen that we take in get to the cells where cellular respiration is going to happen? Well, it goes there by our internal transport system, our blood vessels, and that is part of our circulatory system, of course. All right, so at this point in the lesson, I want to talk about the anatomy and the structures in our body that are part of the respiratory system in a little bit more depth. And so I'm hoping that you've been able to print off the diagram that I've posted with the blank, unlabeled components of the respiratory system, and I want to talk about them now. So when I look at this, I think about, well, where does this start? And for me, I think about, well, it starts when I inhale. So what parts of my body can I use to inhale? Well, I've got my oral cavity, okay, right here. So fancy word for the nose or the space in here that the nose leads to. You might already know it. The nasal passage or the nasal cavity. Now take a minute now at this diagram and see if there are any other components of it that you're already familiar with. And label as many as you can. And pause the video if you need to do that. All right, so let's take stock of how you've done. I'm going to start with maybe the most obvious components. So right here, I think most of you recognize that this is your rib cage. So notice that the rib cage is there to sort of encase your, oops, I'm not getting this away here, this label. There we go. The ribs. And so the ribs are there to protect the lungs. You can see that they're almost sort of shaped as a perfect case around our lung, just to prevent puncture. So let's next see what else we can figure out. All right, so over here, I'm going to start right over here. And for some of the boys in our class, some of the males in our class at puberty, this seems to get a little bit bigger. It actually gets bigger for women as well. It's just not as notable for us. But that is the voice box or the larynx. Now, over here, this is sort of the throat area, what we think of the throat area. And in science, the throat has a fancy name. It's called the pharynx. And I want you to take note, I haven't actually put a label on here, but I probably should. There's like a little flap. Can you see how it's almost like this little flap right here? I want to examine that in a little bit more detail because it has some meaning for us. So maybe add a little stick there and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So now, we're going to inhale air. Air is going to travel either through our oral cavity or through our nasal passage, through the pharynx, and pass down. And you can see that it almost looks like this cartilage. And if you take your fingers and you feel in this area on your body, you'll feel sort of some denser cartilage, right? People think of that as their windpipe, I think. And that has a fancy science name. It's called the trachea, which I'm thinking that maybe some of you were able to get that. So that's great. So just to highlight for you those cartilage rings. So the cartilage rings are there basically to protect your windpipe, to prevent your trachea. So if you were to get kind of hit with something in that tracheal area, or if something were to fall on you, then it's just there a little bit so that your windpipe doesn't get squashed. And of course that would prevent oxygen from getting into your body, into your brain, and that would be problematic for you. So let's follow air along here. So nasal passage or oral cavity, down the pharynx, down the trachea. Can you see how we have a left and a right lung? So, looking at this diagram, this appears to be the right lung, and this appears to be the left lung. But when we label diagrams left and right, we do it as though we're labeling ourselves. So I want you to picture if you were sort of standing in front as this person in the diagram, which side would be the left and which would be the right. Okay, so on your own person, right, your left would be the right on this diagram. That is a confusing topic, and I think that's something I'll probably bring up. If one of you can remind me to discuss it, I'd be happy to bring it up and go over that a little bit more. So at this point, we need to there's sort of like a fork in the road. Fork in the road that leads to each separate lung, our left lung and our right lung. And fork in the road, those two are called bronchi. So singular, we would call it a bronchus. Plural, we would call it a bronchi. Or two bronchi. All right, so you may be thinking that this is sort of starting to look almost like an upside down tree, and that's one way to think about. So the trachea is sort of like a trunk, and then the bronchi are sort of two larger branches that are kind of branching off from that main trunk area. And so you can see there's even further branching here, and all of that is an effort to increase the surface area of our lung and in terms of gas exchange. So the bronchi further subdivide to make these little branches called bronchioles. So, other things that we need to see in our diagram. Now, it's a little bit tough down here to see, so you probably noticed in your diagram that I've labeled this as the pleural cavity, so don't worry about that. That's a little bit beyond grade level. We don't really need to talk about that, but one thing we will be talking about is this thin flap of muscle that is directly underneath your lungs, and it divides your abdominal cavity from what we call the thoracic cavity. It's called the diaphragm. So the spelling of that we will get to. It's, maybe I can type it in here somewhere. Let me see if I can create a text box, even though my screen is sort of a little bit, it's a little bit out of my screen. Diaphragm. Weird spelling. There it is. That's how I want you to label this little purple structure here. We're going to talk a little bit more about it later. So again, air passing into your body through the oral cavity or the nasal passage, passing through the pharynx, your throat, down through this cartilage ringed tube called the trachea, and then branching off into one of your two lungs via the bronchus through to the bronchioles. Now we're not done yet, because at the end of each of these little bronchioles is a little sac-like structure that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So imagine, if we're using the tree analogy, that here's our trunk. We have the big, super large, thick branches. We have little mini branches. And if this were a fruit tree, we might see little sacs of grapes or little sacs of fruit at the end of this. And so those little sacs of fruit that are at the end of each bronchiole are called the alveoli, and that is coming up next. Okay, so what I've got here in front of me, and I hope that you still have it in front of you as well, is sort of a zoom in of some of these structures in the lungs. So just to give you some frame of reference, here is the trachea, and there we're seeing that the bronchi are right here. So one bronchus leading to the left lung, which is on the right side. So then I zoom in, these are my bronchioles, and now in this diagram you can see these little sacs that I'm talking about that are at the end of each little bronchiole. And if we zoom in on one such sacs, you'll see that it looks like this, right? It's sort of like bubbles or like a sack of grapes. And so those are called, one of them is called an alveolus. Okay, there we have it written over here, right? So in this diagram, we're looking at the wall of one alveolus, but here is one, here we have some alveoli. So another thing I want you to notice is that I have this network of capillaries here. So I have a network of blood vessels that's going to be surrounding each alveoli. Okay, and so that's really important, because that's actually where gas exchange is happening. So zooming in even further, if you can envision one of these little balls here, okay, one alveolus, right? You're going to have oxygen coming in with your air through your trachea, down your bronchus, to the end of, your bronchiole, into the alveolus. It's going to go right in there. And these are really thin walled, right? Probably like a cell thick. And they're right adjacent to a capillary, a really small blood vessel. And so that allows for extremely efficient exchange of oxygen that you're breathing in and carbon dioxide that you're trying to get rid of. So you can see this capillary can only fit about one red blood cell as it goes by, as it travels past this alveolus. And as it's doing that, it's almost like, it's picking up some good stuff and getting rid of some bad stuff. So picks up the good oxygen and it's going to transport that throughout our body for cellular respiration. But at the same time, it has that garbage that it needs to get rid of, which is the carbon dioxide that was that waste product from cellular respiration. So then on it goes and travels back to the heart, and the heart will go then pump it out to our body. So here I have it in a little bit more detail. So when we talked about specialized cells, we discussed the red blood cell. And the red blood cell sort of looks almost like a Werther's toffee, almost like a donut where the hole is filled in, or like a frisbee, whatever you want to think about it as. But here it is, and so it's traveling. So this is my alveolus right here, and so you can see here that as the red blood cell travels through the capillary that's adjacent to my alveolus, it's dropping off that nasty CO2 we're going to exhale, but it's also picking up the oxygen that it requires, and it's going to, basically the red blood cell is a vehicle for that oxygen to get to the rest of our body and its cells so that we can use it in conjunction with our glucose to produce energy for our body to sustain some basic life activities. All right, so let's just break that down, just get it down and all in one sequence. This is the sequence that the air would travel through as you were inhaling. So we're going to inhale air with oxygen. It's going to travel through an oral or a nasal cavity, then through our pharynx. It's going to pass this structure called the epiglottis that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, through the trachea, go into either the left or the right lung through one of our bronchi, our two bronchi, through the bronchioles down to the alveoli, and at that point that's where the gas exchange is occurring. Now, of course, if we were exhaling, we would see that our air would pass through these structures in exactly the reverse. So just take a minute to make sense of that yourself. See if you can, without looking at these, at this little part of the note, see if you can think about that. See if you can sort of envision air particles moving in and out of your body as you inhale and exhale, and the particular structures that they have to pass through in order to do that. So the nasal cavity, and that also includes our trachea, is going to be lined with these with epithelial cells. You'll remember epithelial cells are cells that act as a cover, and those epithelial cells are going to have these little hair-like projections, and those are called cilia, and their job is to sort of sweep out some nasty stuff, keep it from going into your lungs and causing damage. Now, they also have some mucus-secreting membranes. It's lined with these mucus-secreting membranes, and all that does is it moistens the air. And why does that matter? Why does air need to be moistened? Well, in order for gas exchange to occur, in order for O2 to be exchanged with CO2 along our respiratory tract at the alveoli, we're not going to see that happen unless the surface is moist. And it's kind of what happens when people get into fires and they are breathing in a lot of smoke, and if that dries out their respiratory tract, then gas exchange becomes really difficult. And we're going to see that actually with the frog. When we dissect our frog, we're going to look at, well, why is it important that the frog remain moist, that the skin remains moist? So keep that in mind. That's a little bit of an anticipation point. We'll talk more about that when we get back to class. So it's also lined with capillaries to warm the hair as we inhale. I mean, I don't know if you've ever inhaled on a really cold day. It can be kind of painful. So those capillaries, which are blood vessels, are carrying blood that's at our body temperature, and that's going to work to warm up our air before it gets into our body. So next I want us to write down a little bit of what I've already discussed, just so that you have it in your notes. So right here is just a table. If you want to create it as a table for yourself, feel free to do that. So I'm going to sort of discuss each of the structures one by one. So the first one, I'm not going to talk about the oral cavity or the nasal cavity. We've sort of just talked about that a little bit. So I'm going to start with the pharynx. So remember, the pharynx is that special word that we use for throat. And so I said that I would talk a little bit more about the epiglottis. And so I've got this animation here, and here is my epiglottis. So this little thing that flops down here. And what it is the flap of tissue that covers your trachea, which is your windpipe, so that your food doesn't go down into your lungs when you swallow. So let's look at that right here in this animation. I'm going to wait for it to start again here. So here's a ball of food, a bolus of food being swallowed. back here is your esophagus, and in front of here is your trachea. So trachea is in front, your esophagus is in back. Take a look at what happens with the epiglottis, this flap, as the food moves down. Notice that the flap has to go down in order for food to enter into your esophagus. So food moves down, flap closes, food goes down the right pipe. So when somebody has said, oh, I'm choking because my food went down the wrong pipe, maybe you ate too quickly, you swallowed too quickly, and your epiglottis didn't have time to sort of flap over, and maybe a little bit of whatever you were swallowing ended up going down the trachea instead of the esophagus. So that is how the epiglottis works. Okay, moving right along. Remember, the trachea is that tube that is surrounded by that cartilage in order to support and protect your windpipe. Your bronchi is what your trachea branches into in order to reach your left and your right lung. So singular is a bronchus, so one bronchus leads to your left lung, and one bronchus leads to your right lung, but together they are bronchi. And the bronchioles are going to be the extensions of the bronchi, further increasing the surface area. So we're thinking about this like the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles, almost like an upside down tree, right? Trachea is like the trunk. The bronchi are like the big branches that sort of deviate from the trunk. The bronchioles are those smaller branches. So what comes next? Well, there's the fruit at the end of the tree. Those are the alveoli. I'm going to move this up just a smidge. So the alveoli, remember, are those tiny little air sacs that are at the end of the bronchioles, and the fact that there are millions and millions of alveoli drastically increases the surface area through which oxygen can be exchanged for carbon dioxide. So that allows us to be able to efficiently take in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. Now, in order to do that, they need to be surrounded by that capillary network that we saw. So very, very thin-walled capillaries next to our thin-walled alveoli allows for our CO2 and O2 to be exchanged. So next I want to talk a little bit about breathing and the diaphragm. So you'll remember the diaphragm in our original diagram was that purpley, in the other diagram it was purpley flap of muscle that was just beneath the lungs and that separated your chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. So most people think that when you breathe in, that your diaphragm must be moving up. So take a deep breath in and feel what that feels like, how your body moves, right? So you take a deep breath in and your rib cage moves up. Now, take a look at this little animation here. You'll see that when your rib cage expands to take in that extra air, when you inhale, the diaphragm actually has to move downward. So that seems a little counterintuitive, but the reason it has to do that is because imagine, you're blowing up a balloon. When you blow up a balloon, that balloon is taking up more space. So in order to accommodate the extra space in your rib cage, then your diaphragm needs to move down. So here's another diagram showing the same thing. So when you inhale, you're going to be expanding that rib cage, and that will allow your diaphragm, lots of interruptions today, in order to accommodate the extra air. So here's our diaphragm, this green little component of this animation moving down as you inhale. So when you exhale, the reverse thing happens. Your rib cage is going to relax. Your rib cage is going to relax, and your diaphragm is going to move up to balance out the pressure. So one thing that's kind of cool is that your breathing rate is controlled by a part of your brain. That's actually how it works, is it detects the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood, the concentration of that CO2 in your blood. So think about times where you're going to be producing a lot of CO2. You're going to be producing a lot of CO2 if cellular respiration is happening quickly. And when is that going to happen? When your body needs a whole lot of energy. In fact, I'm going to go back to that diagram, or you know what, I'm just going to type it in right here. So I would have glucose plus oxygen reacts to make carbon dioxide and water, right? Plus energy as well. That's kind of the whole point of it. So when are you going to be producing a lot of carbon dioxide? Well, when you have a lot of carbon dioxide being produced, it's probably because you're burning a lot of fuel. So when are you going to be burning a lot of fuel? Probably when your body needs energy. And so what types of activities would be happening where you would need to be burning more energy? Well, I can think of a few. But one in particular would be exercising. So if you're exercising, your body is using up energy at a faster than normal rate. And so that means that your body's going to respond by burning more of the fuel, burning more glucose. But here's the thing. Unless you have oxygen present, your glucose is not going to produce as much energy. And so what happens? Well, your body is going to react to that by breathing more rapidly, right? Your breathing rate is going to go up. And it's going to know to do that because you've been burning all this extra fuel, which has produced all this extra CO2. And so that's what your brain is really detecting. So that was kind of a mouthful. I'm going to set you up with some homework here. I'm just going to shift my screen so that you can see it. So here it is. So your homework is on page 95, numbers 1 to 4. I'd like you to do that in conjunction with maybe reading over and reviewing the notes and putting aside any questions that you have for me of aspects of our lesson today that didn't quite make sense for you.